Kim, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start. Obviously, Israel has made moves towards Rafah, the last main refuge in the Gaza Strip, and looks like it will eventually do a full out ground invasion or some sort of escalated military campaign. What's your take on this?
Well, they've concentrated all of the people, pretty much everybody in the Gaza Strip, to this one little area. And it's going to be a humanitarian disaster, which is something that even the US government has been saying over and over to Israel, that this is going to be a giant humanitarian disaster. I've been saying from the very beginning, since October 7th, since they started, well, not October 7th, but shortly after, when the Israelis decided they were going to go into Gaza. They started in the north, and I said on my show numerous times, what they're going to do is they're going to start in the north, and they're going to start pushing all the people further south, saying evacuate, 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 pushing them further and further and further closer to that Egyptian border, in hopes that they devastate the entire strip of Gaza, making it uninhabitable. And the people that are stuck, the 2 million people essentially in that bottom little portion, there will be then an enormous amount of pressure on Egypt to open up the gates and let the Palestinians in, effectively clearing the land of the vast majority of Palestinians. The Israelis are comfortable with 20% sticking around, maybe 30%, but they really don't want it. They won't go above 30%. They want to keep it really at 20%. They will let some Palestinians stay. That's always been their MO, because for one, it gives them cover. They could say, well, we didn't get everybody. There are, like they say now with Israel proper, they say there are 2 million Arabs living in Israel. They've actually stated this 20% number. This was something that Ben Gurion said early on when he was doing the things he was doing to try to build the state of Israel, was that 20% can stick around. We can manage 20%. They won't be a majority. They won't have any political power. They'll be here to work. They'll be our workers. They'll be our grunt laborers, and we need them. And the rest will have to go. So what their plan clearly has been to push, and unfortunately, this is what's transpired, is that they did start in the north, and they slowly just started pushing everybody further to that Rafah border. And now they want to go into Rafah. But what they're really wanting to do is force other countries to start taking Palestinian refugees to clear the land, and Egypt as well. But Egypt isn't having any of that, right? Egypt is now saying they're going to join South Africa against Israel at the ICJ. It's the United States has said it's a humanitarian disaster. But nonetheless have continued sending the weapons and allowing them to do this, even though what the U.S. has been demanding this whole time is at least give us a plan that is reasonable and attainable for some humanitarian efforts for these people. The Israelis refuse to put forward any viable plan that even the U.S. government is saying, yeah, okay, then the innocent civilians will be protected. They're not doing that, and so here we are with a real serious crisis. And then you've got these guys marching on Independence Day earlier this week in Israel, saying that they're looking for the true solution. Um,
Oh,
yeah, the rhetoric is blatant and obvious and in our faces for what they're looking for. They're not shy about it. And now there's an internal battle, with the Israelis. They've got a lot of the leadership are not that extreme. They don't want to take over Gaza. They don't want to be invading and settling and doing all of that. And they want a solution for the Palestinian people that is viable. And they're at war with Netanyahu and Netanyahu's far right extremists that are saying things like we're looking for a true solution.
yeah, and understandably so. I mean, there's some very fringe figures high up in the Israeli cabinet and government that have said some outrageous things for sure. I think the thing is, basically everybody that I've spoken to who's rational, even on either side of this conflict, acknowledges that going into Rafah is already and is going to be an even worse humanitarian crisis. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be a disaster. But I know some people who argue from a place of honest that's honestly where they're coming from. They feel they have no choice because Hamas still has battalions in Rafah. They still have some military capacity. And October 7th, on the scale of as a terrorist attack, right, 1,000 civilians killed, relative to Israel's population, that's bigger than 9/11. And
Right.
so when I put myself in their shoes and I think, how could they possibly allow this group to remain in power? Because if they remain in Rafah, it stands to reason that they'll exert control over the rest of the Gaza Strip, or they could plan another attack. So if I put myself in their shoes, as much as this humanitarian crisis is devastating and compelling, I can see why they would want to finish the job. Like, we wouldn't have sat contented with mostly eliminating the people who did 9/11 on our border, right? We would have, if they had one last refuge, we would have gone in. Now, maybe we would have been wrong to do so if we killed too many innocent people in the process, right? Which I think is the critique a lot of people make of our post 9/11 wars, that they weren't just, they weren't justified. They did have a vast humanitarian toll. But that is the perspective, right? That they can't sleep at night with Hamas still in control and still having any capacity so close to their border. I can understand why people would feel that way. And what do you make of that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of responses to that, different angles. The first thing is that they have been saying, not publicly, but to the military. I mean, the military conversations that have been had amongst our military with Lloyd Austin and other higher ups in our defense, that they've been saying since October. The Israelis have been saying that Rafah is the hotbed for Hamas. That's not it's not that Rafah has become the hotbed because they pushed them south and now they're suddenly there. It's that they've always been in Rafah. And our government, we have now reports that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and others then questioned the Israelis back in October, saying, then why not start there? Why are you starting in the north and working your way south when Hamas is in the south? That is because the agenda is not just to eliminate Hamas. And if it was the agenda to eliminate Hamas, then why not actually eliminate the leadership of Hamas, who are out not in Gaza, but instead in Doha and Qatar? They're all over the world. They're everywhere other than Gaza, doing television interviews. It's as if Mossad can't off people that are not in Gaza. Of course they can. We know that they commit assassination. They do assassinations all the time. Well, maybe not all the time, but they have assassinated people. We've seen assassinations of Iranian leaders and whatnot. They're able to pull it off. So if they truly wanted to get rid of Hamas as an organization, then they would be going after the leaders who are not sitting in Gaza, and they would be assassinating those leaders. They would be going after the actual leadership, and they're not. They're not going after the leadership. They've got either the Israelis, it turns out, are terrible at intelligence, even though they've sold this idea that that is their greatest export, that they are the king of intelligence. Either they're terrible at it and they really don't know anything that's going on, or they're not being honest about the intelligence that they have. There is one Hamas leader that they're trying to go after in Gaza. Are you telling me that they don't know, with all of their overhead surveillance, that they don't know where that guy is? Of course they do. Do they know where the hostages are? Of course they do. Either that or they're just really bad at intelligence. They have every single phone bugged in Gaza. They have for a long time. They have overhead surveillance. They have everything. They know where everything is. So they're intentionally, it's very suspicious that it could be that they're intentionally not going after the actual leadership. Otherwise, they could assassinate. They could go after the actual leaders that are inside Sinwar, who's inside of Hamas, who's inside of Gaza, actually. But they're choosing not to. As far as the people, the militants go, these kids that are 18, 19, 20 years old, these fighters that have only grown up in a blockaded Gaza, where they're not even allowed cookies and chips and macaroni and crayons. Since they were little, they've been blockaded by Israel. Of course, they're angry people. They don't need to be, they're not Hamas leadership. They're not part of the Hamas political organization. They weren't old enough to even vote Hamas in. Maybe they're part of the militia groups, but they're always going to be, even if you eradicate Hamas, and this is really what Israel's playing on. If you eradicate Hamas, you get rid of the leadership and there's no more Hamas as an organization, which I agree. I don't think Hamas should be in charge of the Gaza Strip. They need to absolutely end Hamas's reign in Gaza, 100%. How do you go about doing that, though, when it's a political idea? It's not, it's like MAGA, right? It's like, how do you just eliminate any support for Trump? Well, if you don't, if we were to put it on that scale, right? You've got an entire nation where a lot of people love Donald Trump and they want to vote for Donald Trump. And okay, so then after January 6th, they say, well, we got to eliminate this ideology. It's dangerous. They're raiding the Capitol. They're committing acts of terrorism. So they've done everything they can to try to eliminate Donald Trump from ever becoming president of the United States again, short of assassinating the, but let's just say that it was like real bad. And what they did was like October 7th. You think that they would, of course, tried to off Trump, right? They would have tried to assassinate the guy to end the leadership. But then that would cause a serious uprising. And then how do you then, if we were to live in this kind of parallel world and it was here on our soil, how would you then eradicate Trump ideology from so like Trump's dead now, his
They would
cabinet's
rally
dead.
around somebody else.
Well, sure they would, right? So you would never end MAGA. Like you can't end that ideology and the people that are willing to rise up and revolt or fight. I mean, you're only making it worse, actually, in this particular situation. If you were to off Trump, I mean, you 100% make it worse. So how do you, that's for them to just say they're going to kill basically all the young men. I mean, that's the only way, the strategy that they seem to be using is we'll just have to eliminate all men because that's the fighting groups. And then you end up with just a bunch of women. And we've had reports, I don't really report on them on my show because I can't verify them. But there's circulating reports of that. Well, we've seen images of them rounding up groups of men of all ages, from teenagers to older men, and them being stripped naked and taken away. And they say, and maybe legitimately, well, we have to suss them out to see if they're Hamas. And I think there's maybe a legitimacy to that claim of like, we have to suss everybody out to see who's the terrorist and who isn't the terrorist. I don't discount that. But then there's reports that then they would take up some of the men and they would kill all the men in a group and leave the women and children and make them flee and head off somewhere. And, I don't know how true those reports are, but if that's true, they're going after the men. Because that would be the only way to eliminate the threat, I suppose, is to eliminate every single male potential fighter who's going to rise up one way or the other. And if the young guy now wasn't a Hamas militant, I mean, he surely would become one after this. I mean, this is going to turn a lot of these young men into, and Hamas could be gone. It won't be Hamas. It'll be some other group because they're so angry. They're so traumatized. What else can they do? So I don't, the idea that I understand we have to eliminate Hamas's power and leadership, but I don't think we've even seen this in our own country, the persecution of Trump, just taking him to court over and over and over, whether he's guilty or not. Such a bad idea. In fact, Mitt Romney actually said something intelligent. I don't like Mitt very much. But he did say something quite wise yesterday or the day before, where he said, if I were Biden, I would have pardoned Trump and I wouldn't have allowed this circus of like him going into courts all the time over and over and over to happen.
It's made him more popular.
Well, not only has it made him more popular as a figure, but it's also delegitimized the courts. People now a huge population of the American people no longer trust the court system. They no longer trust the justice system. It is really done a ton of damage on the Americans' feeling about our justice system, about the DAs, about prosecutions, about all of that. All it's did was create a serious, serious lack of trust in that institution, which is extremely damaging in the long term. So it was a horrible idea for Democrats to be carting Trump into court after court and using the justice system to go after him, legitimately or not. Even if it was totally legitimate, one should think twice. If you're truly caring about American democracy and the American system, you should think twice about what that will do to the American feeling about these systems. And it has eroded them. So it was beyond damaging. It's not just what they're doing to Trump, they've done it to America. So it hasn't helped. This going after doesn't help. There's other ways to politically achieve your goal. What they could have done with getting rid of Hamas, for example, is they could have said, look, we will end the blockade. We will we will have a two-state solution. Hamas just can't be there. It can't be Hamas. Then let the Palestinian people say, all right, then we don't want Hamas, because they're going to guarantee it's in writing now, a signed paper, not just some flippant declaration, but an actual two-state solution is now ready for us and available,
But
like a
could they
real
do
one.
that though, given that Hamas isn't, they haven't held elections in many years. They've kind of taken over, right? So could the people just easily cast off Hamas?
Sure. I mean, they got a bunch of fighters in there. Can't they just turn their guns on Hamas? Yeah, they could.
I
I mean,
guess
all these
if the
people
hearts and
want.
minds changed.
Well,
But the
but towards what? I mean, the thinking, I think the misconception is thinking that Hamas is an Islamic ideology and that these people are trying to bring back hardcore Islam. That is not why the vast majority of the people voted for Hamas or even support Hamas or take up arms under the banner of Hamas. That's not what the Palestinian people. Are there caliphates in the Middle East? Yes. Are there groups that are looking to create these Islamist idea, enclaves? Yes. Hamas is just not one of them. Are they conservative? Yeah. Do they prefer women to wear the hijab? Yeah. But do they demand it? Is it part of law? No. They're just not. They're less radical than Saudi Arabia is when it comes to Islam. So they're Hamas won, and Hamas has continued to gain support and have support because the Hamas leadership, the political group, is willing to do whatever it takes to free its people. That is what their stance is. That is what the Palestinian people have rallied behind. It's not because they want Islamic ideology to run rampant in their region. It's just when you talk to Palestinians, either there or in the West Bank or anywhere, they're actually quite secular people. They're not really, I mean, there of course are some that are more Islamic. They've had to turn to religion because what else do they have? If you're in Gaza, you're born and raised in this situation, your life sucks. You get electricity 4 hours a day. You get running water 3 days a week. You get no cookies, no chips, no all these things that they're telling you can't have. Life is hard. They then once in a while come through and mow the lawn, they call it. The Israelis had a policy of going in and just bombing Gaza every so often just to show them who's boss and who's really in control. So, they grow up under these circumstances and all they've got is to turn to God. I mean, at that point, what are you going to do? You're like, God save me. God help me. One day I'll be living in a better place. My current physical earthly home is so bad, but if I am a good Muslim, if I adhere to God's law, then at least when I die, I'm going to be going to a nice place. I mean, that's all you got. So when you
Yeah.
create an environment like that, people turn to God because what else are they going to turn to? I mean, when people are being tortured, non-believers, right? Non-believers, when they are in terrible situations, their children are hospitalized, dying, when they themselves are being tortured or something's going on, they suddenly turn to God. Anybody will turn to God. So you got people that already believe in God. They're going to turn to God even more when their circumstances are terrible.
And I think that's part of the reason that people turn to extremism. I mean, I think Hamas is evil. I think October 7 was evil. But if I
Right.
put myself in the shoes of a little boy who grew up under a blockade and who lost family members who were killed by the Israeli military, maybe I would have ended up an extremist. I don't know. I think it's impossible to say. And I think that that doesn't just come from nowhere, but that doesn't make it right. And that doesn't make I understand that Hamas, and I know you're not saying that, but Hamas
Right.
tells the people that they'll do anything to fight Israel. But Hamas has not worked out well for the Palestinian people.
Well,
October
nothing
7th
has, but
hasn't
nothing
worked out
has.
well. So I'm perplexed, honestly, by the continuing levels of support for Hamas among the Palestinian people, especially I believe in the West Bank. But I mean, is it the outcry of a people who are oppressed? Maybe, but I mean, surely they should have seen by now that that wouldn't work for them.
Nothing has, though. I mean, they've tried every angle and every type of, they've tried everything and they have gotten nowhere. And so, you then just go to, well, then we'll violently have to take it back. I mean, there have been periods of time where they've tried violence, wars. They kind of go back and forth. They continue to flip back and forth between strategy to strategy to strategy. So starting from the very beginning, it's the strategy of, okay, we'll fight, we'll do war. Okay, now we'll do resistance of some kind. Now we'll speak up to the international community, hoping that they'll step in. Okay, now we'll do war again. Now we'll do, they've done this. I mean, in 2018 and 2019, there was a lot of peaceful resistance amongst the Gazans. They would show up at the border and they would just protest. They would protest every Friday night. They would do these protests. I was there in the West Bank at the time that they were doing these protests, and I met with doctors, American Christian doctors, who was staying in the same hotel with, and they had come to go into Gaza and treat the young men and the children who would be at these protests peacefully on Friday nights, that the IDF would just shoot. Just peaceful protests, and they would shoot them. And these doctors would tell me that, these kids that they would be treating had their eyes blown out, had their arms blown off. They wouldn't kill them, but they would maim them. And they would, to just show that they would kill some. There were many that lost their lives, but the rest, they had a policy of maiming. That was their policy, to just shoot your eye out or shoot your arm off, shoot your hand off, just to teach you a lesson, blow your leg off. And these doctors then, they were like, yeah, it's really, it's atrocious what's happening. These were Christian, white, lady had blonde hair sitting there saying, yeah, I got sent here to go into Gaza to help these kids. And it's unbelievable. And then she says, would you like to see some photographs? And I said, sure. I want to see what you went through. Her and the other doctor then opened up their laptops. She was traveling with an older doctor. They opened up their laptops. They tried to show me photographs, but she was like, where are my pictures? And the gentleman doctor also said, they both sat there and they were kind of confused, and they were looking for their photographs. And then finally she says, oh my gosh. I mean, when we left Gaza, we had to give our devices over to the Israelis, and they took the devices for 4 hours. And you know what they did? They went in and they erased every ounce of evidence that these doctors had of what the IDF was doing to these children. And that was peaceful protests. And they were doing that in 2018 and 2019. So the Palestinian people have tried a variety of tactics, and they have ended up just abused in those situations every time. So it makes sense that people would then say, okay, now let's try violence again. And every generation tries. I mean, it's like, it happens every 20 years or so. And it's like every time a group of kids grows up and gets to that age, they say, we tried this peaceful stuff. We've tried telling the international community, and now let's try some violence. And it just seems to happen every 20 years. I mean, the last time the second intifada was 2000. So it's 20 years later. And here we are once again with another violent outbreak. So they try, and then a new generation grows up, and the new generation says, I'm sick of it. I'm fed up. I'll try violence. And of course it ends up what happens is it's used against them, obviously, every time. Then the Israelis can point to the violence and say, see, this is what we're talking about. We can't live with these people. They're violent. They're rabid dogs.
So, speaking of the next generation, I do want to get your take on the ongoing anti-Israel protests that we've seen at college campuses across the country. We've seen encampments, we've seen buildings being taken over, we've seen people making calls to divest from Israel, and we've seen it really spark a big debate about the lines of free speech, anti-Semitism versus hate speech, and some interesting flip-flopping on what constitutes free speech from people who were once on the opposite side of that question. What's your overall take on these protests?
I think that, I understand that the criticism, I'll start with the criticism. The criticism of these protests is that these are just ultra woke college students. They'll protest anything. They just kind of get on the bandwagon of the thing of the day. And I think we've definitely seen evidence of that, right? We've seen a lot of college students that just seem to protest anything, and they've certainly been anti-free speech on their own at many of the college campuses, where maybe a conservative would want to come and speak, like a Ben Shapiro or a Candace Owens or whoever would show up, and they would then say, we don't want that, we're going to protest, we don't want them here, we don't want these people, they're dangerous. We've seen a lot of this, I think, anti openness that college students are supposed to have, open minded. It's supposed to be a place of open minded and discussion and tossing around different ideas, even radical ones. That's what college is supposed to be about. And we've seen sort of this opposite behavior over the last few years coming from the liberals, when historically, and it was so shocking that it was coming from the liberals, because historically it more came from the right, where the Christian, which really dominated much of American society for so long, would say, we don't want, these leftists that have these agendas talking and speaking, and, gays and blacks, and, depending on the time, right? And we saw the conservatives were really hardcore on that. Now it's the liberals, and in liberals back then were like, we just want to be ourselves and free and speak. And why
I'm
can't we
not
have
old
this
enough
open
to remember
society?
those days, but I know it was the case.
Well, I grew up in the 90s. I was born in 80, but I grew up in the 90s. That's when I came to my adulthood, right? And that the 90s were, in my mind, a really wonderful time. It was just so great. The 90s were, I was watching all the main shows, and all the main musicians we watched, for example, were black, like Arsenio Hall, and we were watching the Cosby Show. I know Cosby, but nonetheless, our idol. There was Michael Jackson came out with the song, it doesn't matter if you're black or white, we're all. And it really was a time that I felt like there was a real equality that was happening in society, and an openness. And people were more like, yes, people are gay, it's okay. Like, we should be more open. People are appalled by when a gay person was attacked. Like, there was, I think, more openness developing. And then I don't know, took a hard left somewhere, like a turn, and things just kind of started going in the opposite direction. And it's really unfortunate. And I don't know who was in charge of that or why that happened, but certainly something happened. And in particular, I would say since Donald Trump, something really happened to the left on the political spectrum, where they just went crazy and they just could not believe Trump. They thought he was a fascist. They went into this kind of wild direction. And then they got into this direction of like, if you don't accept that a man is a woman, you are the problem. It's not him that's the problem. When he goes around saying he's a woman, he wants to go to all these female spaces and compete against women. You're the problem for not accepting it. We've seen this kind of radical thing that's kind of happened. And so I can understand the criticism on these college protesters of, they're just woke mind virus, crazy people. They don't even know what they're protesting, because sometimes they don't. But just because they don't know last time or the time before that doesn't make them wrong every time. And we have to be careful about that when it comes to anything from news organizations to protests to opinions of people. Just because you disagree with them 90% of the time doesn't mean there is a portion of time when you actually might agree with them and they might actually be right on this one thing. I've
It's true.
experienced that as I come from the left politically. I've always been a leftist. And then suddenly I had to start having this mind issue. I had to rework my whole viewpoint in the world when I started agreeing with people on the right. And I had to be like, whoa, wait a minute here. I didn't think I could ever agree with Glenn Beck, but here I am agreeing with Glenn Beck on this particular issue. What is happening? We just have to be more open-minded and independent. So the college students, there are, sure, does Fox News find the one college student at these protests who has no idea why they're protesting, and they stick that person on
It is pretty
camera?
funny when they ask them what river and what sea after they've just been chanting from the river to the
Right. And
sea,
they
and
don't know, or they don't know anything. I mean, I do feel like the agenda driven out there, especially those that want to just demonize the protests and make these college students look stupid, they find the one person. They literally go around sussing out, asking and asking, and then they only air the idiot, just just to prove their point that these college kids don't know what they're doing. But I
yet
think what's Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I was going to say there's nut picking in every movement. They did this to the Tea Party. They would go and
Right.
find, the craziest son of a bitch in the crowd and then present him
Right.
as this is what the whole Tea Party believes. And I'm
Yeah.
absolutely willing to acknowledge that when it comes to the campus protesters, there's been a bit of that. There's always a bit of
Yeah.
that with any protest movement. But what I will say though is that there are two issues I have with the protests. One
Okay.
is they've gone beyond free speech, like in setting up an encampment in a public space and then blocking people from accessing public buildings. That's not free speech, right? I will defend their right to say whatever they want, to have protests, to hold up signs, even if it offends people, even if people think it's hate speech, even if people think it's anti-Semitic. But the encampments are kind of a different thing. And like where I am in Michigan, just at the University of Michigan, these protesters have started showing up at the regents' homes in the middle of the night with bloody sheets, fake corpses, and lists of demands they're nailing to their front door. All like I've just seen a lot of these protests cross the line from what can be considered speech into indefensible and in many cases criminal actions. And I'm just not okay with that regardless of their message.
I think that, well, I don't agree. I think that there are times when it is okay to be to do these types of things, to be more disruptive and even destructive. For example, well, for one, during the South and segregation, the attempts to desegregate, there were many times when there were people chaining themselves to things or taking over. Wasn't there a one where they sat in at a restaurant bar, like on the counter and sat there and would not leave? And I think that there's times when you can demonstrate in this way beyond just speech, and I think there's times when it's important to do so because the situation is so dire. I would say, like for example, a story of the Danish during World War II, which I'm Danish, so I know this. This story's passed down in my family because they're so proud. But the Danes during World War II, when the Germans occupied, they would do these resistance types things where they sort of allowed. They were doing a peaceful. They kind of did a peaceful deal with the Nazis where they said, "All right, you could be here. We won't resist you. We won't fight you. But kind of treat our people okay." But the Danish people would see the Nazi trains going through, and they would destroy their own train tracks in order to stop the Nazis from using their train tracks. They would do these little sabotage things privately. People, not the Danish military, but people would do things to be disruptive to stop them. Now, we don't look back at that and say they were wrong, that they could have used their free speech and they shouldn't have destroyed the train tracks. Of course, we applaud them for destroying the train tracks. We say that they were heroes in doing this. There's um
Well, just on
when
that, the
yeah.
one difference that I see is the difference in targeting the actual party that's involved. So, for example, you're doing that sit in at the diner. That's a segregated diner, and you're protesting segregation. In this case, they're protesting college administrators over something Israel's government is doing. And I guess they're getting US support from the US government. But like, even I looked into this with the University of Michigan, the financial ties between the University of Michigan endowment and Israel are all very indirect and they're minuscule. There's not much involvement here. It's like they're in the same way when they're blocking traffic and they're blocking a bridge, right? These people that they're inconveniencing aren't the ones doing the thing they're mad about or upset about or protesting, and that's why I view it differently than some of the things you just outlined.
Well, but every penny counts. So if you get all of the universities to divest, then even if it's a little, even if each university or each college has just a tiny little bit of investment, and it might even be obscure or roundabout, if you could get that to stop, there is a significant, it all adds up eventually. What I think actually about these protests that I'm more impressed with versus previous protests from college students is that they have outlined their demands. And many of them have been able to get their demands met, and the universities have negotiated with the protesters. They have conceded. And I know that gets criticized a lot by some that don't want them to concede to the protesters. But I think it's important that, for example, Black Lives Matter. I don't know what the demand was. I still don't know what the demand. And then it turned into, because there was really no demand except like what it seemed like was like treat Black people better, or stop police violence, which is like, what can I do about that? What could you do about that? Right? There was like nothing, but they were marching through our streets. But then it turned into defund the police, and that was like such an outrageous ask that I was like, nobody's gonna defund the police, really. And if we did, then and then there were some police departments that then cut back, and it ended up disastrous. I mean, it was just like a disastrous ask, and it was like an outrageous ask. But these students seem to be asking for something obtainable, and in cases, the universities have negotiated and they've ended their protests because they've actually done the thing that's obtainable, which is the students saying, we want you to look into your investments and we want you to divest. And so the universities then say, okay. I mean, it would be one thing if these students were protesting saying, we want you to end the war in Gaza. Well, what can a university do about that? That's as ridiculous as defund the police. It's like, oh yeah, like what can your college president do about ending the war, the Israelis' bombardment on Gaza? They can't do anything about that. But these college students are asking for divestment, boycott, divest. And obviously the universities can't sanction, but boycott and divest, and they're achieving it. So I actually think these are pretty good protests.
Well, some of the demands are unreasonable. It's different in every location and every protest.
Sure.
I'll grant you that. But here at the University of Michigan, one of the demands that they stapled to the Board of Regents members' doors at 4 a.m, masked people did this past week, was defund the campus police is part of their encampment, ironically
Right.
enough. And I know that's
Yeah.
not the case at all the protests, but they are
Right.
doing some unrelated things. I am pretty skeptical of the divest push for the universities with how the endowments work. I mean, they would have to, in many cases, divest from index funds to actually not have even a penny invested in an Israeli company. And I'm also, I can understand why people would want to divest from an Israeli, arms manufacturer or something, but just divest from an Israeli like sugar manufacturer or something. I'm not sure that's what the point of that is, or whether that would really register or make a difference. And it would be disruptive to these endowments that are supposed to be simply maximizing the returns, because that's what they use to fund scholarships for students who can't afford college. That's what they use to pay their faculty, is the return on these endowments. And I'm pretty wary of opening that Pandora's box of political pressure shaping the investment decisions, because these students, if you cave to their demands on this same crowd will set up an encampment 2 months from now about some other cause. They'll be like, we want 6 different gender bathrooms installed in every dorm, and we're going to set up an encampment in the center of the quad and block people from getting to class until we get our way. I mean, I worry about that. If you indulge this form of what I see as destructive protest, they'll come back with it for more. But back to kind of the main topic, I don't think these protests are helping the cause at this point. I mean, maybe you feel differently, but basically everybody I've spoken to or talked to about the protests views them as something of a sideshow that's sucking oxygen out of the room, distracting from the Gaza humanitarian crisis, and putting kind of a radical face on the pro-Palestinian cause that is, associated with the social justice, the woke left, and a lot of things that aren't very popular with most Americans. So even from the pro-Palestinian point of view, I'm not sure these are constructive at this point.
Oh, I think they are. They're majorly constructive. They're showing Israel that the young generation is not on their side. And that is why they've gone so hard after TikTok. Why do you think they're banning TikTok? They're not banning TikTok because they're really, truly afraid of China. I mean, they've been saying that for years. There's no actual threat there. They're only banning TikTok and trying to ban TikTok because they are really alarmed by the fact that young people seem to be turning away from Israel. And these college campuses, these protests are showing that that's very much the case, that these young people have changed their minds. That should frighten Israel more than anything. They could, whatever they do, what should scare the hell out of them is that the young people in America are no longer on their side. They have lost an ally, because eventually the Lindsey Grahams of the world die. The Joe Bidens of the world die. These guys die. They're not going to be around forever. They're old. And when
Yep.
they do, a younger generation is going to come up and take control. And that younger generation has changed their mind. So they've lost the narrative, they've lost the support. And that is enough pressure, honestly, just amongst the Israeli government to really rethink their strategy on if they want to maintain their alliance with the United States and the support from the United States for generations to come, for decades to come. They've got to rethink this. And I think that is what these college protests are showing. If nothing else, that is what they're showing. And I think that's actually good enough. The Israelis have spent so many decades under the shield of no information being put out there about the Palestinian plight. All the mainstream media parroted the Israeli point of view. All the Christians in the country parroted the Israeli point of view. All of us were just getting the Israeli point of view for so long. But what has changed is social media, the internet, right? So now suddenly kids are able to see, and they're the ones using social media, TikTok, that's why they want to ban it. They're the ones there using it, and they're seeing a different reality than what they've been what they've been told by mainstream media all this time. That should just scare the hell out of Israel. That alone. These kids could just be protesting just to say, we see you. And if that's all they did, it's good enough because it is making change. It's scaring them. Now they're trying to censor, they're trying to ban, they're going even more aggressive on those censorships and bans. And ultimately, that is only, again, making it worse. It's only gonna strengthen the cause and the reasoning, and people are gonna feel more justified against Israel. So yeah, I mean, I think just that alone, just the youth rising up and saying we see you is actually
Hmm.
big enough.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on the TikTok thing. The government wants to ban TikTok because of the content of the app, not because of nebulous and hypothetical national security concerns. They don't like the ideas and messages being expressed on there, which is why
Right.
I've been a big opponent of the TikTok ban, even though I'm pretty critical of TikTok personally. I have a lot of issues with the app and the people on there, but we're
Yeah.
on the same page on that one. But the second issue I have with the protests is I do feel there's been a disturbing blurring of the lines. And I know that a lot of the protests have been peaceful. A lot of them are peaceful, intentioned people. But there has been video after video of people saying things that are pro Hamas or pro violence against Israelis at these protests. And then what concerns me is like that could have been nitpicking. Like maybe I've just been watching too much Fox News. But I went and looked at the
Mhm.
polling for this age group of 18 to 24. And I found polling from October, so after October 7th, but
Mhm.
before the full invasion of Gaza. And at that time, among 18 to 24-year-olds, this Harvard Harris poll, 51% said it was justified for Hamas to
Mhm.
slaughter 1,200 Israeli civilians. That was the polling question. I
Mhm.
see a disturbing, not just anti Israel, not just wanting to change US policy towards Israel, but a support for radicalism or violence intermingled into these protests that I find really concerning.
Oh, well, they've been like this the whole time. I mean, what? Not even just about Israel. I mean, these kids have been like this about Trump, about MAGA, right? They say, I'm going to punch a Nazi in the face, right? They've been saying that since 2016. So what we've got, I think it's a legitimate, I don't think it has anything to do with the Palestinian or the Israeli. I think it's a mindset of our youth that I think has been very alarming to me personally as well, that they're so willing to engage in violence when they feel like there's something worth engaging in violence about. Um, to me, when it really set me off was or the alarms were set off when they would say, I think it's justified to punch a MAGA person in the face. Like they're a fascist and you would punch a Nazi in the face. So you should be able to punch a MAGA fascist in the face. And that was a really popular narrative that was going around once Donald Trump was elected to president. And so there is an alarming trend in our youth that precedes this, that thinks violence is an appropriate action. We see that even with when, especially when talking about Donald Trump, when the left begins saying things like, well, we're going to have a violent takeover then, if these people are going to stay in charge, then we have to have this violent takeover. There's a lot more rhetoric in our younger Generation Z they're going to change the world. I don't know if it's going to be for the better or for the worse, but they're definitely more engaged and radical on everything. So, it makes sense to me that when it comes to this particular issue, they would then say similar things that they've been saying about everything else. And I don't find it just on the left, to be honest. I find it on all sides, right? There's like, they just frame it differently, or it's about a different issue. But the youth seem to be much more radical. The question we should ask ourselves is, what have we done to, it's kind of like the Palestinian youth stuck in Gaza for the last 20 years that have grown up and now they're fighters for Hamas. What did Israel do to create that situation? I think it's fair to ask that without saying it's fine for them to have committed October 7th acts of violence. I think it's fair to then say, is it wrong for them to have committed this type of violence on these innocent people? Absolutely. But can we also then look and say, what led up to this? There was something that led up to this. It didn't just happen out of nowhere because these people are hateful, angry people. Something led to that. I think we need to be asking ourselves, what has led to our youth here in this country having these radical ideas where they believe they could punch a MAGA fascist in the face, or that they think it's totally fine for Hamas to have broken out and killed innocent women and children? What is it about them? What have we done to create this? Because we did something. It's us. It's our fault.
That's a really good point and a really good question that we can leave people with to ponder, because it needs to be answered. I don't know what the answer is. I'm sure you don't have all the answers right now, but that is the question, because I don't like where things are headed, but none of this is happening in a vacuum. Kim Iversen, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.